Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I have a video for you. It's been a while since I did one of these by myself. I've been live streaming for the last several days. If you haven't seen those, you can go over to my YouTube channel. You can go over to the Patreon, patreon.com/Eric Draitser, or actually, I think you can see my recent interview on Counterpunch with Khalid Medani about Sudan. But of course, recent days have been somewhat dominated by the question of what in the hell is going on in Russia? So let's discuss what in the hell is going on in Russia. So obviously, I don't have to provide a tremendous amount of background. I would think most people already know that we had a pretty monumental couple of days. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the founder and the head of the Wagner Group, the Russian mercenary outfit, led well, depending on how you look at it, either an attempted coup d'etat, a march for justice, a political stunt, political theater. I'm going to get into all of the different ways that we can look at this, but the march of Wagner forces, I should say, basically from Ukraine up towards Moscow, reaching basically within 200 kilometers of the capital. This was unexpected, certainly. This was, I think, a revelation for a lot of people, a revelation in the sense of, well, just how weak and brittle Putin and Putin's state and power might be, but also the degree to which opposing political forces have emerged inside of Russia. We'll talk about all of that. But I think the place where we should begin, at least, is talking through some of the possible motivations for Prigozhin and whoever else was backing him and was operating with him. So I'm going to lay out at least four, though they're somewhat related, possible motives. I'll explain, of course, what I think, and it'll be fairly obvious here. The first is that Prigozhin led a so-called March for Justice. So the background here, and this is what Prigozhin said in his own audio recordings released on his Telegram channel. So this is his, stated objective with all of this was a march for justice. In other words, this was supposed to be, according to Prigozhin, a kind of political protest designed to essentially appeal directly to Putin to more or less to arm and supply Wagner over the objections of and around the Ministry of Defense, Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, etc. Okay, so this is how he presents it, right? That this is something akin to, I don't know, other historical moments in Russian history where the masses must make the great appeal to the Tsar, right? It's not, of course, it's not the Tsar himself who is at fault. It's not the Tsar or the policies of the Tsar. It's those, those boyars. It's those landowners. It's the aristocracy, etc. Similarly, today, it's a very kind of a Russian sort of way of doing protest where, Putin himself is sort of in many ways presented as infallible, but it's Shoigu, it's Gerasimov, it's the bureaucracy, it's the other oligarchs or whatever, right, that are getting in the way. And so Prigozhin's major beef, basically, or at least the stated beef, was that Wagner forces were doing the heaviest lifting in and around Bakhmut and some other key battles, and that they were not being supplied with ammunition, with body armor, with rations, with all of the things that they would need to be supplied with. And eventually, according to Prigozhin, this spills over with a direct attack by Russian military on the rear lines of Wagner. I believe that was supposedly happened last Friday night. That was what allegedly directly precipitated Prigozhin saying enough is enough and leading this quote unquote march for justice. So this is Prigozhin's stated kind of reason. So what, in terms of how this all evolved, I think we could say, theory number one is basically that the March for Justice, as he calls it, simply got out of hand, right? That Prigozhin did not expect a protest march of this kind that was designed to kind of present him as a major political force in and of himself, that this was never intended to seize power, right? But maybe to present Prigozhin as a, political force, as I said, right? But by virtue of the fact that they found almost no resistance, the fact that they basically just plowed through hundreds of kilometers of Russian territory on their way to Moscow, basically unopposed, almost in a sense made Prigozhin a victim of his own stunt, where he was trying to carry out sort of a political protest, a political stunt that eventually then became real. Right. And I think it was maybe one way of looking at it is that at the moment that it became real, at the moment that you saw them digging trenches around Moscow, at the moment that you saw actual Russian pilots being killed by Wagner's forces, I think Prigozhin, I wouldn't say he so much lost his nerve as I don't think he ever had that nerve in the first place. I don't think he necessarily intended for things to go exactly the way that they did. But the fact that they did then raises another question. Was Prigozhin expecting popular outpouring of support? Because he does have a good deal of support inside of Russia, certainly from the far right, from the real hardcore ideological revanchists, etc. He does have support, and this is, I think, illustrated by the reactions to his Telegram audio, which were almost evenly split down the middle, 138,000 fire emoji reactions and 137,000 clown face reactions, right? So pretty even split as to whether Prigozhin is a hero or a clown or a traitor, right? So this is, I think, let's call it motive or theory number one, that a political stunt called the March for Justice or whatever got out of hand, and that Prigozhin, once it got out of hand, had to scramble to find an escape hatch, which he did in the form of going to Belarus and making that deal. Okay, so that's one. Another possible motive that I think, and I should say, these are not all necessarily mutually exclusive, but I think they are distinct. A second possible motive is the coup attempt, or the alleged coup attempt, or the quasi-coup attempt, as basically being a secondary motive, and that the primary motive was raising Prigozhin's profile nationally. It's not that he didn't have a high national profile. Of course he did. He was one of the most well-known oligarchs in Russia before he got, Wagner in Ukraine, but rather to position Prigozhin as an actual political force inside of Russia. This is one of the key things to understand about Putin's regime, is that they have systematically destroyed any political options other than themselves, right? Of course, there's some token opposition. The Communist Party of Russia, Zyuganov, who has long since been understood to be in Putin's pocket, representing a kind of controlled opposition, but there's no real political opposition. Well, there is, but it's to Putin's left in the form of liberal Navalny. Navalny really represents the only national figure in Russia with a profile, large enough to consider them a political force, a real political force. Not only a profile, by the way. Navalny has a whole infrastructure and teams of people that work with him. So Navalny is just kind of a center liberal type. Now you could make the argument that Prigozhin has presented himself as an alternative to Putin on Putin's right, appealing to the more hardcore elements in Russia. And again, that is what we saw in this march. Those who did come out in support of Prigozhin clearly embracing the hard right politics. And it's not just the politics. I mean, it's sort of the barbaric kind of nature of Prigozhin's actions. I mean, Prigozhin was releasing videos in front of piles of dead bodies. Horrific stuff. And they love him for it. There's an element within Russia that loves him for it. That's the element that he appeals to. And you could make an argument that this stunt was also designed to kind of launch Prigozhin politically. I'm skeptical that that would have been anything close to a primary or even secondary consideration, but it's possible. It's worth considering that now, and this is a point I don't know that many people are making, now Putin really does have somebody to his right and to his left. And this raises a number of other interesting questions about the political dynamics in Russia moving forward. I'm not suggesting that United Russia is not going to continue rigging elections, that they're not going to continue winning office in corrupt ways. But now there is a real political force out there, and Prigozhin has made himself into a political force. That's very clear. You can see it every time he releases something on Telegram. All right. Another possible motive, and this is one that's been floated around a number of times, and I've seen it from, well, I wouldn't say from people that I think necessarily have any direct knowledge, but this is one that's been floating around, that this whole thing was actually theater, that this was fake, that this was staged, presumably for the purposes of, you know, I don't know, allowing some kind of feint whereby Prigozhin and Wagner forces go to Belarus ostensibly into exile, and then, swoop in and, have some kind of a glorious victory over Ukraine and march all the way to Kiev. Who knows what, right? This idea, it doesn't make much sense to me. Just from a tactical perspective, I don't think anybody would be fooled by any of this. The Ukrainians certainly aren't. I saw British and U.S. generals on television, immediately following all of this saying, well, Ukraine would be fools to not be watching Belarus and not be watching their northern, flank and so forth, right? So I don't really see much in the way of trickery here. Now, I also really have a hard time believing that a stunt like this, which so badly damages Putin's credibility and the Kremlin's credibility, not only with the people of Russia, but maybe even more importantly with other oligarchs, right? It strains credulity for me personally to believe that this would have been staged. Now, I suppose one could maybe say that maybe there was some idea to stage it and then that itself got out of control. I don't know. It's hard for me to believe, but I do think it's worth at least mentioning because, that stuff floats around on the internet. And then, all right, there's the other aspect to this, which is simply that this was self-preservation, that Prigozhin understood that his power is entirely based not on his wealth, but on the forces that he controls, on Wagner itself. And there is, of course, in the background, this looming July 1st deadline. And that July 1st deadline was the deadline by which Wagner fighters had to sign contracts and be absorbed into the Ministry of Defense. In other words, at which point Wagner would cease to be Wagner and would essentially, in a way, be absorbed into the Ministry of Defense, into the armed forces. Now, that's oversimplifying it because there are shell companies involved in Wagner. There's an overseas component to it. There's many aspects to Wagner as an enterprise, but that was on tap. So was Prigozhin worried not so much about his money, but about his actual power being taken away from him and given essentially to Shoigu? I think this also is a part of it, and this has been reported in mainstream media as well, so it's not really speculation. And in fact, I would say that some of these motives are probably all kind of interrelated and playing off of each other, or at least several of them are. So with that said, let's talk about how and why this ended so quickly. And then after that, I'm going to close with some of the repercussions, both within Russia, but maybe even more importantly, outside of Russia. But how it ended, how and why it ended so quickly, I think now would be a good time to reference Alexander Zamyatin, who is a well-known Russian leftist who has written some pretty good analysis. I'm going to be going off of some of the points that he makes, but obviously expanding on that. One element of why this ended so quickly, why it ended so quickly, is the simple fact that both sides here, both Prigozhin and Putin, really do lack popular support. I mean, there are a lot of people who support Prigozhin, and of course there are a lot of people who support Putin. But when this all went down, there was no mass outpouring into the streets. You did not see, Putin's call to arms being heeded by, tens of thousands of soldiers pouring into the streets. You didn't see that. You didn't see Russian military consolidate, ready to come smash Prigozhin. You didn't see that. At the same time, you didn't see regular, ordinary citizens coming out and cheering for the Russian military or really for cheering for Wagner. I mean, you saw some of that in Rostov. You saw a little bit of it, but not a ton. And so as I would argue, and as Zamyatin, I think, correctly argues, the fact of the matter was when the moment of culmination came, both sides saw that they were essentially powerless to destroy the other side, right? Putin, or rather Prigozhin, understood clearly that there was simply no way that this was going to continue. He wasn't going to seize power. Hell, he wasn't going to conquer Moscow. He probably wasn't even going to get to Moscow, right? Because the Russian armed forces did have the capacity to absolutely obliterate Wagner, to wipe them out with airstrikes and everything else. Of course, they could have done that. But the lack of popular support then raises a political liability for Putin. If you crush this somewhat popular figure, are you now essentially sowing your own demise? Are you now raising the stakes and potentially destabilizing your own regime by crushing a somewhat popular force like this? On the flip side, Prigozhin, of course, knew that he wasn't seeing the popular mass outpouring. There was no mass defection of low rank and file military. There was no significant, armed divisions moving over. None of that happened. Right. So both of them, I think, ran out of options. And I think that's an important point. And so you saw a lot of what you might call wait and see. Wait and see just what is going to happen, and then we'll pick a side, right? You saw that both from regular citizens, but you also saw that from the military. You saw it from Russian police, many other forces as well. I think that, again, we also have to point out that Prigozhin divides Russian opinion. And for that reason, as I kind of was just saying, he presents something of a problem for Putin, where Putin can sort of caricature Navalny as a stooge of the West. It's very difficult to make Prigozhin into that. Now, there have been reports, and this is also worth looking into, there have been reports that Prigozhin had approached Ukrainian intelligence about potentially exchanging Russian troop positions for a withdrawal of Ukrainian forces from Bakhmut in order to give the glory to Prigozhin and Wagner that they conquered Bakhmut. That's rumor. I don't know that that's totally confirmed, but it would, more or less align with what we know about Prigozhin. So there's a lot of different reasons, I think, why this thing ended as quickly as it did, because quite frankly, neither force had the power. Both of them understood this to be a humiliation and embarrassment. And I think both of them really needed some kind of a quick resolution. Now, for Prigozhin, this could absolutely end with him being thrown out of a window, or it could end with Prigozhin continuing his operations, building up his own base, and attempting to essentially do what Navalny has done, but from Putin's right. So anyway, that's something to consider as well. I'm running out of time and voice. So let me just quickly talk about a couple of repercussions of all of this, because there are a lot of them. I think first and foremost, we should point out that this is, of course, a watershed moment in the history of Wagner. Wagner's primary function, aside from actually winning territory in Ukraine or fighting over territory in Ukraine, their primary contribution to Russia is in their posture and their positioning footholds all throughout Africa. You have Wagner forces basically upholding multiple military junta governments. You have that certainly the case in Mali, questionable corrupt governments that are backed by Wagner in Central African Republic, in Burkina Faso, it's certainly in Sudan, where the Russians, where Wagner is known to be stealing tremendous amounts of gold, in Mozambique and other countries as well. Russia, through Wagner, has gained access to precious metals, minerals, other very, very necessary exports, resources that the Russians are using to insulate their economy from the crushing sanctions that have been imposed by Europe and the United States and some of their other partners. And so the issue of Wagner in Africa now becomes critical, because if you're the military junta in Mali, or you're the government in Central African Republic or Burkina Faso or any of these places, you count on Wagner to ensure your own survival, your own security. That's the whole reason they're there. Mali is a perfect example. The military junta that seized power kicked out the French. That's good. The French are neocolonial bastards who have been exploiting their former territories in Africa for decades and decades. So that's good, right? Well, the military junta, in order to secure their continued grip on power after kicking out the French, simply invited in the Russians, invited in Wagner. And what do we have now? Wagner in charge of multiple gold mines in Mali, including a very large one that is on the Mali-Ghana border, as was revealed by the former president of Ghana. We know that they have access to gold reserves, that they have access to so much. If you're these countries, you have to, or rather these governments, you have to be feeling very, very nervous right now. And if you're a strategic planner, an imperialist of the ruling establishment in the United States or in Britain or in France or really any of the former colonial powers, you must be licking your lips watching this. Wagner had presented a very significant obstacle to Western neocolonial designs on Africa. Wagner was carrying out the kinds of massacres and wholesale looting and raping and pillaging that we would historically associate with British or French or Americans or what have you, right? So now that this transformation has happened and Prigozhin seems to be out and Wagner seems to be sort of up in the air, what is the Russian state going to do? And more importantly, what are these African states going to do? Now, if you're in those governments, I would be willing to bet there are very serious discussions about how you're going to survive this, especially if one day Wagner says, okay, see you later, right? Because remember, part of the way that the United States and the West influences events in Africa, especially, is through their sort of coordination and control and coercion and training of the various militaries in Africa. So if you're that military junta in Mali, for example, you're going to be looking over your shoulder at some of your other military pals who may have their own channels to the United States or to anywhere else, right? So the coup plotters of several years ago may themselves get couped. And that is, of course, where Wagner came in. Wagner was coup-proofing these governments. Not so much anymore, is it? And again, this raises a number of other questions too in Africa. What role is Wagner having in Sudan? We know they're stealing the gold, but we also know that they help to prop up the government, right? The government that's now essentially in a civil war against the former Janjaweed, now as the security forces, right? So how is that going to be impacted by Wagner potentially retreating, or if they don't retreat, being sort of transformed or under new leadership? The other piece of this, and I know I'm kind of going fast here, but I want to try to keep it under 30 minutes. The other thing that needs to be understood is that the Russians do not simply have one private military contractor. It is not Wagner and Wagner exclusively. There are several others, including some that have come online just in the last several months, that potentially could step in to fill the void, even if it's no longer under the Wagner brand, including one private military contractor called Convoy, a private military company based in Russian-annexed Crimea. This group called Convoy is headed by Sergei Aksyonov, who is the Kremlin-appointed governor of Crimea, and it is directly headed by Konstantin Pikalov, call sign Mazai, who is a former Wagner Group leader who is formerly called Yevgeny Prigozhin's right-hand man. So think about what this means. They also have, by the way, other private military contractors through Gazprom. I think they're called Flame and Torch or whatever it is, right? Where they're recruiting out of their own security personnel and sending those fighters into Ukraine, many of them veterans of the Soviet Afghan war and Chechnya and other wars, So anyway, you have other private military contractors. Are they going to step in to Wagner's footprint? Is Wagner simply going to stay there under new management? Is Wagner going to cease to be Wagner and simply become part of the Russian Ministry of Defense? That is a real interesting question too, because Russia had been so shy about sending its military directly into any of these countries. That was part of the whole, sort of reason for Wagner's existence, is that it could sort of do things in ways that the Russian military couldn't. For instance, go into Syria and be absolutely massacred by U.S. air power in that infamous incident a number of years ago. Those bodies came home with no names. They didn't exist. They weren't real people with real families. You don't have to acknowledge it. You don't have to do anything if you're the Russian state. But say, for instance, now in Mali or in Sudan or in Central African Republic, it's not Wagner forces, but direct Russian military fulfilling that role. And then all of a sudden, a Russian military plane is shot out of the sky. Now you have a political incident inside of Russia. It makes for much more complicated optics and much more complicated political balancing act for the Kremlin. So, as I've already said, and I want to reiterate, whether it's a collapse of Wagner, or whether it's a retreat of Wagner, or whether it's just a transfer of Wagner's ownership, this will have ripple effects in Africa for sure. And again, if you're the United States or France or the British, this is like, all you could have ever asked for, where you may be able to eject the Russians out of these countries without ever really having to do much of anything. So that's an important aspect of all of this. And then what impact might it have on Russia's ability to continue insulating itself from the impact of sanctions? That's another piece of this, right? Because so much of the kind of red-brown propaganda has been, the sanctions are so ineffective. The sanctions are so ineffective. Well, part of the reason for that is because the Russians are lining their pockets with hundreds of billions of dollars that they're looting from Africa. What happens when that spigot runs dry? All right, we're going to, I think, leave it there, but I want to just leave you with a couple of additional comments about this. We have seen, well, certainly in my lifetime, we have seen the collapse of the Russian, quote unquote, Russian state, the collapse of the Soviet Union. So a full-blown state collapse in Russia is not inconceivable. It shouldn't be. You shouldn't forget that it was only, 32 years ago that happened, right? So we also saw, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, just how weak and brittle the Russian state is. So there's a lot more to come. And then I would also just point out again, the liberal opposition, which is totally demobilized and really without power, they may also feel somewhat reinvigorated by this, because now Navalny may actually represent more of an alternative for some segments of the Russian general masses. Navalny's appeal has always been, broad, but with a very clear constituency. Now there's a potential that Navalny's appeal may grow as kind of a third option against these two horrible options of Prigozhin and Putin. That's an interesting dynamic to continue watching. Of course, as I mentioned, in Africa, and then also in Ukraine. The Ukrainians immediately put out statements about how, well, this clearly shows that Putin and the Russian state no longer have a monopoly on violence, and, Prigozhin and this and that, right? So the Ukrainians, of course, are using this for their own propaganda, their own psychological warfare, trying to drive wedges between the various factions within the Russian elite. That is going to continue. And that, of course, plays into more broadly the counteroffensive that the Ukrainians are launching now. So what's happening on the battlefield is related to all of these political developments, and the capabilities of the Ukrainians are going to be directly related to, well, the defensive capabilities of the Russian military, which are questionable in light of all of this. So a lot more to say, but I will leave it there. So what's happening in Russia? A hell of a lot. Stay with Counterpunch, subscribe to Counterpunch Plus. There's going to be a lot more there, not just from me, of course, but from many of our other contributors, some of whom agree with me, some of whom certainly don't. So Counterpunch Plus is the subscription. If you want more videos and stuff from me, patreon.com/Eric Draitser. Subscribe on the YouTube channel. Really appreciate it. Talk to you all next time. Peace.